Antarctica. It is the most unforgiving, isolated, and freezing continent on the face of the Earth. A sprawling wasteland of absolute white. But in the immediate aftermath of World War II, right when the rest of the globe was finally putting down their weapons, celebrating victory, and sending their exhausted soldiers back home, the United States military did something completely baffling. They did not demobilize. Instead, they packed up one of the largest and most heavily armed naval armadas in history and sent it straight into the freezing, uncharted heart of the South Pole. They called it Operation Highjump. Leading this massive force, which included over 4,000 men, 13 warships, and a massive aircraft carrier, was Admiral Richard E. Byrd. Admiral Byrd was not just a typical military officer. He was America's most celebrated and decorated polar explorer, a genuine national hero who had already conquered the skies and the ice. Officially, the United States government told the public that this was merely a routine scientific expedition, a simple chance to test military equipment in extreme winter conditions. But let us be logical for a moment. You do not send a massive war fleet armed to the teeth just to look at penguins and measure the thickness of the ice. They were looking for something, or perhaps they were hunting someone. For decades, incredible rumors have swirled about what truly happened down there in that biting, blinding cold. There are whispers of secret, fortified underground bases, advanced aerial technology that completely defied the known laws of physics, and most importantly, a hidden private diary kept by Admiral Byrd himself. It is a diary that allegedly reveals a truth so completely shattering that the government forced him into silence and locked his words away for years. Today we are going to unpack the entire epic saga of Operation Highjump piece by piece and explore the mind-bending claims hidden within Admiral Byrd's secret journal. Before we dive deeper, ignite that like button. Tell me in the comments where you are listening from, what time it is there. The visuals are here to add context, but they aren't necessary to follow along. To truly understand the sheer strangeness of Operation Highjump, we first have to take a step back and look at the world as it was in the years 1945 and 1946. Imagine the scene. World War II, the most devastating and exhausting conflict in human history, had finally come to a close. Millions of soldiers were returning home to their families. In cities across the United States, there were massive ticker tape parades, cheering crowds, and a collective sigh of relief that echoed around the globe. People were ready to rebuild. They were ready to put down their rifles, take off their uniforms, and return to a normal, peaceful life. The factories that had been churning out tanks and bomber planes were transitioning back to making cars and washing machines. However, behind closed doors in the highest levels of government and military intelligence, the feeling was very different. There was no true peace. There was only a tense, uneasy pause. The world was rapidly splitting into two distinct halves. On one side stood the United States and its Western allies, and on the other stood the Soviet Union. This was the very beginning of what we now call the Cold War. But you do not need a degree in political science to understand the Cold War. Think of it simply as a massive, high-stakes staring contest between two heavily armed giants. Neither giant wanted to throw the first punch because they both knew it would mean total destruction. Instead, they began to look for any possible advantage they could find. They scrambled to secure new technologies, new resources, and new strategic locations around the globe. In this atmosphere of intense paranoia and secret maneuvering, the the United States military began looking at the map. They looked to the sky, they looked to the oceans, and eventually their eyes settled on the very bottom of the Earth, Antarctica. At that time, Antarctica was a massive blank spot on the map. It is a continent larger than the United States and Europe combined, covered in ice that is, in some places, miles thick. It is a place of endless darkness in the winter, howling blizzards, and temperatures so cold they can freeze human flesh in minutes. It had no cities, no native populations, and seemingly no military value. Yet suddenly the United States Navy decided it was absolutely critical to send a massive fleet down there. But you cannot just send a fleet of regular sailors into the most hostile environment on the planet without a leader who knows exactly what they are doing. The military needed a commander who understood the ice. They needed someone who had stared death in the face in the polar regions and survived. They needed a hero that the American public completely trusted and adored. There was exactly one man on the entire planet who fit that description perfectly: Admiral Richard E. Byrd. To fully grasp why Admiral Byrd's later claims about secret diaries and underground civilizations are taken so seriously by so many people, you have to understand who this man was. Richard E. Byrd was not some wild conspiracy theorist sitting in a basement making things up. He was not a science fiction writer. He was, without exaggeration, the ultimate American action hero of the early 20th century. If you were to look for a modern equivalent, you would have to combine the prestige of the first astronauts to land on the moon with the adventurous spirit of a real-life Indiana Jones. He was a man of science, a brilliant navigator, a decorated military officer, and an absolute legend of aviation. Born into a wealthy and influential family in Virginia, Byrd could have easily chosen a comfortable, quiet life in politics or business. Instead, he chose the sky and the sea. He graduated from the United States Naval Academy and quickly became fascinated with the brand new invention of airplanes. Keep in mind, flying in the 1920s was nothing like hopping on a commercial jet today with a cup of coffee and a movie screen. Early airplanes were incredibly fragile machines made of canvas, wood, and wire. They had no pressurized cabins, no GPS navigation, and engines that frequently failed. Every time a pilot took off, they were rolling the dice with their own life. Byrd not only embraced this danger, but he also mastered it. He became a pioneer of flight navigation, inventing new instruments that allowed pilots to fly over open oceans without getting lost. His true fame, however, came from his obsession with the absolute extremes of the Earth. In 1926, Byrd and his co-pilot Floyd Bennett made international headlines by claiming to be the very first men to ever fly an airplane over the North Pole. When he returned to the United States, he was greeted with a parade in New York City, and he was awarded the Medal of Honor, the highest and most prestigious military decoration in the country. But Byrd was not finished. Having conquered the North Pole, he immediately turned his sights to the south. In 1929, he led a massive expedition to Antarctica, established a base camp on the ice called Little America, and successfully flew an airplane over the South Pole. This was an unbelievable logistical and physical achievement, transporting airplanes, fuel, dogs, and men across the roughest oceans in the world and then successfully flying over a frozen, mountainous wasteland cemented Byrd's status as a global icon. He was a man who pushed the boundaries of human endurance and technological capability. Yet perhaps the most defining moment of Admiral Byrd's life the event that truly proves his immense psychological strength and credibility, occurred a few years later in 1934. During his second major Antarctic expedition, Byrd decided he needed to gather meteorological data during the brutal Antarctic winter. The problem was, no human being had ever spent a winter completely alone in the interior of the Antarctic ice shelf. The conditions were considered a guaranteed death sentence. Byrd, entirely unfazed by the danger, had his men build a tiny wooden hut buried deep under the snow, more than 100 miles away from the main base camp. He called it Advance Base. As the sun set for the long, months-long polar night, Byrd sent his men back and remained completely alone. For weeks he endured temperatures that plummeted to 80 degrees below zero. It was so cold that his breath would instantly freeze into a solid block of ice on the walls of his tiny shelter. Then disaster struck. The small stove he used for heat and the engine he used to power his radio began leaking poisonous carbon monoxide gas into the unventilated hut. Byrd slowly began to suffocate. He became terribly ill, suffering from agonizing pain, extreme weakness, and hallucinations. He was slowly dying in the pitch blackness, buried under the snow, completely isolated from the rest of the human race. Any ordinary person would have panicked. Most would have surely perished. But Byrd was a man of extraordinary iron will. Even while severely poisoned and barely able to stand, he forced himself to keep a meticulous journal, recording the weather data he came to collect. He dragged himself across the freezing floor to crank the radio generator, sending out normal-sounding Morse code messages to the main base so his men would not risk their own lives trying to mount a rescue mission in the deadly winter darkness. He endured this silent, agonizing torture for months until a tractor team finally managed to reach him in the early spring. When they found him, he was emaciated, fragile, and near death, yet he had survived. This specific story is incredibly important to remember as we move forward. Why? Because it establishes a rock-solid baseline for Richard E. Byrd's character. He was a man of profound logic, immense bravery, and unshakable mental stability. He was a meticulous record keeper who valued scientific truth over personal comfort. He had proven beyond any shadow of a doubt that even under the most extreme physical and psychological distress imaginable, his mind remained sharp and focused. Therefore, when we eventually look at the bizarre claims surrounding his later secret diaries, claims about lush green valleys hidden in the ice, ancient flying machines, and encounters with beings not of our known world, we cannot simply brush them off as the ramblings of a crazy person. If a random sailor made these claims, history would have ignored them. But these claims are attached to Admiral Richard E. Byrd. They are attached to a man who possessed the highest security clearances, the utmost respect of the United States government, and a proven track record of flawless observation under pressure. By the time 1946 rolled around, Admiral Byrd was a living legend. He was the undisputed master of the polar regions. So, when the United States Navy decided to launch Operation Highjump, assembling a massive, heavily armed fleet of 13 ships and over 4,000 men to sail into the treacherous, ice-choked waters of Antarctica, Byrd was not merely invited to come along. He was the only man capable of commanding it. The government handed him the keys to a colossal military machine and pointed him toward the frozen south. Officially, as the massive ships pulled out of their ports, the press was told that Admiral Byrd was simply going back to do what he did best, explore the ice, test some new cold weather gear, and maybe map a few unknown coastlines. It was packaged for the public as a peaceful, scientific endeavor. But the men on board those ships, looking at the massive stockpiles of weapons, the fighter planes, and the sheer combat readiness of the fleet, knew that this was no simple scientific field trip. They were preparing for something massive. They were heading into the frozen unknown, and Admiral Byrd was leading the charge into what would become the most mysterious military operation of the 20th century. To truly understand the sheer scale and the underlying paranoia of Operation Highjump, we have to rewind the clock just a little bit. We need to go back before the end of the war, before Admiral Byrd assembled his massive American fleet, and look at the years 1938 and 1939. This is where the historical record begins to blur beautifully and terrifyingly with urban legend, myth, and the origins of one of the greatest conspiracy theories of the 20th century. To figure out why the United States sent thousands of heavily armed men to the South Pole, we have to look at the people who went there first, the Third Reich. In the late 1930s, Germany was quietly and rapidly preparing for a massive global war. To wage a war on a global scale, a nation needs resources. You need iron, you need rubber, you need oil, and, surprisingly, you need fat. At that time in history, one of the most vital commodities on the global market was whale oil. Whale oil was the petroleum of its day. It was an essential ingredient used to manufacture margarine to feed the massive German population, but much more importantly, it was a critical component in industrial lubricants and the manufacturing of nitroglycerin for high explosives. Germany was importing millions of tons of whale oil from Norway, and the leadership knew that the moment war broke out, those supply lines would be immediately cut off by the British Royal Navy. They needed their own source. They needed a foothold in the primary hunting ground for the world's whales, the freezing, untamed waters of Antarctica. So, in the winter of 1938, a German expedition set sail under the strictest secrecy. They took a ship named the Schwabenland. Now, the Schwabenland was not a sleek military battleship. It was a bizarre, heavily modified freighter. Its deck was fitted with massive steam catapults designed to launch two heavy Dornier flying boats, large seaplanes that could take off and land on the water directly into the sky. Their mission was simple but incredibly ambitious: sail to the bottom of the world, find a massive chunk of unclaimed territory, and plant the German flag firmly in the ice. When the Schwabenland arrived at the coast of Antarctica in early 1939, the crew went to work. They launched their seaplanes day after day, flying deep into the frozen, uncharted interior of the continent. But how do you actually claim land that is nothing but a constantly shifting sheet of white ice? You cannot exactly build a fence. The German solution was brilliantly efficient and highly cinematic. As the airplanes flew over the freezing wasteland, the crews manually dropped thousands of heavy metal darts. These darts were specially designed to plunge deep into the ice and stand straight up, and at the top of every single dart was the swastika emblem. They essentially peppered an area of Antarctica the size of the state of Texas with these metal markers. They claimed this massive territory for themselves and named it Neuschwabenland, or New Swabia. If the story ended there, it would just be an interesting footnote in the history of global whaling. But during these flights, the German pilots saw something that completely defied logic. As they flew over a region roughly 50 miles inland from the icy coast, the endless white plains suddenly cracked open. Below them, entirely surrounded by towering glaciers, was a massive rocky valley that was completely free of ice. Even more incredibly, there were liquid water lakes shining in the sun. In the middle of the coldest, most frozen desert on the planet, they had found a warm, brown and blue oasis. Today, geologists call this area the Schirmacher Oasis. We now know that it is kept warm by natural geothermal activity, essentially heat radiating up from deep inside the Earth's crust, acting like a giant underground radiator that melts the snow and keeps the lakes liquid. But you have to put yourself in the mindset of the 1930s. Finding a warm, liquid lake in the middle of Antarctica was like finding a lush, green forest on the surface of the moon. It was a staggering discovery. This real, documented geographical anomaly is the exact seed that sprouted the darkest and most enduring legends of the Antarctic ice. When the expedition returned to Germany just months before the outbreak of World War II, the military high command was thrilled. And this is where the hard facts of history begin to sink into the murky, terrifying waters of speculation. According to decades of rumors, leaked documents and military whispers, the Third Reich did not just map New Swabia, they decided to colonize it. The rumor goes that the German leadership, who were notoriously obsessed with the occult, ancient mythologies, and the idea of hidden subterranean worlds, saw the warm lakes of the Schirmacher Oasis as an entrance. If there was geothermal heat keeping the surface warm, there had to be massive heated cave systems beneath the ice. The legend states that throughout the war, while the world was distracted by the bloody battles raging across Europe and the Pacific, the German Navy was quietly running a secret supply line to the absolute bottom of the Earth. Using their massive, long-range transport submarines, they allegedly began ferrying brilliant scientists, heavy mining equipment, and advanced technology to the Antarctic coast. There, beneath the ice, utilizing the natural geothermal energy of the caves, they built a massive, impenetrable underground city. They called it Base 211. Base 211 was rumored to be the ultimate safe haven, a Shangri-La made of steel and ice. It was said to have immense underground docks where submarines could surface directly into dry, heated caverns without ever exposing themselves to the freezing weather above. It was rumored to be completely self-sufficient, powered by the Earth's internal heat, and dedicated entirely to the development of highly advanced exotic weapons, specifically aircraft that completely ignored the traditional laws of aerodynamics. In short, they were building flying saucers. Now, a skeptic might ask, how could anyone possibly believe a story this outrageous? How could a nation fighting a losing war on multiple fronts possibly spare the resources to build a sci-fi villain's lair beneath the South Pole? The answer lies in a series of incredibly bizarre documented events that occurred right at the end of the war, events that sent shockwaves of panic through Allied intelligence agencies. In 1943, Grand Admiral Karl Dönitz, the supreme commander of the entire German Navy and the terrifying U-boat submarine fleet, made a very public and deeply mysterious speech. Standing before his officers, he proudly declared, "The German submarine fleet is proud of having built for the Führer in another part of the world a Shangri-La on land, an impregnable fortress." At the time, Allied spies dismissed it as arrogant propaganda. But then May 1945 arrived. Germany unconditionally surrendered. The war in Europe was officially over. The Allies ordered every single German submarine roaming the world's oceans to immediately surface, fly a black flag of surrender, and head to the nearest Allied port. Most of them complied, but several advanced U-boats did not. They simply vanished into the deep. Months went by. Then, in July 1945, a massive, heavily armed German submarine, designated U-530, suddenly surfaced off the coast of Mar del Plata, Argentina. The crew surrendered to the Argentine authorities. The submarine was completely empty of cargo, and the crew had destroyed all of their logbooks. When interrogated, the sailors refused to explain where they had been for the last 2 months, or what they had been doing in the freezing waters of the far South Atlantic. If that was not strange enough, a month later, in August 1945, a full 3 months after the war had ended, another massive German submarine, U-977, also drifted into Argentine waters and surrendered. 3 months is an impossibly long time for a submarine of that era to remain hidden at sea. The living conditions inside a World War II U-boat were a claustrophobic nightmare. It was essentially a dark, dripping metal tube filled with the stench of diesel fuel, unwashed bodies, and rotting food. To survive in those conditions for months while actively dodging Allied patrols requires a mission of absolute, desperate importance. Where had U-530 and U-977 been? What or who had they unloaded before showing up empty in South America? The public imagination immediately ran wild. The newspapers printed sensational headlines. People began connecting the dots. The 1938 expedition, the warm oasis in the ice, Admiral Dönitz's boast about an impregnable fortress, and now a ghost fleet of submarines emerging from the freezing southern waters months after the war. The conclusion they reached was both thrilling and terrifying. The highest-ranking officials of the Third Reich, perhaps carrying their most advanced, world-ending technologies, had not perished in the ruins of Europe. They had escaped. They had fled to Base 211 in New Swabia, hiding safely under a mile of impenetrable ice, waiting to strike again. Were these stories true? Did it even matter? If you are sitting in a high-level military intelligence briefing in Washington, D.C. in 1946, and you see this timeline of events laid out on a table, you cannot simply laugh it off. Even if there is only a 1% chance that a rogue, scientifically advanced enemy faction is building weapons in a secret polar base, you have a duty to investigate. You cannot leave a blind spot that massive unchecked. The United States government realized that the only way to know the truth for sure was to go there. They needed to tear the roof off of Antarctica and see what was hiding underneath. And they could not just send a few scientists in parkas. If the rumors were even partially true, if they were about to sail into the backyard of an enemy holding advanced technology, they needed to bring the biggest, heaviest, and most intimidating hammer the United States Navy possessed. That hammer was Operation Highjump, and the man chosen to swing it was Admiral Richard E. Byrd. When you read the official history books, the United States government will tell you that Operation Highjump was simply a training exercise. They will tell you that it was a standard scientific mission designed to test how military equipment, ships and men would perform under extreme, freezing conditions. But let us use our common sense and look at the actual facts on the ground. When you want to test some winter boots, a new type of radar, or see how a truck engine handles the cold, you send a small team of engineers to Alaska. You do not assemble an invasion force. What the United States Navy put together in the final months of 1946 was not a scientific expedition. It was Task Force 68, and it was a fully operational, heavily armed, and incredibly massive armada of war. To understand the sheer absurdity and the terrifying scale of what Admiral Byrd was leading, you have to picture the logistics of moving a small, modern city across the globe and dropping it into a frozen wasteland where absolutely nothing can survive naturally. Let us look at the numbers, because the numbers are staggering. Task Force 68 consisted of 13 massive naval vessels. We are talking about destroyers designed to hunt submarines, heavily armored cruisers, massive cargo ships, a submarine named the USS Senet, and specialized Coast Guard icebreakers. But the absolute crown jewel of this armada, the ship that proves this was no peaceful field trip, was the USS Philippine Sea. The USS Philippine Sea was an Essex-class aircraft carrier. It was a floating fortress of steel that stretched nearly 900 feet long. Imagine a skyscraper laid on its side, floating in the water, packed with explosive aviation fuel, heavy munitions, and a massive flight deck. Bringing an aircraft carrier to Antarctica is, from a naval perspective, an incredibly dangerous and somewhat crazy idea. Aircraft carriers are not designed to hit ice. They have relatively thin hulls meant for speed in the open ocean. If a carrier strikes a massive iceberg, it can tear open just like the Titanic. Yet the military deemed it absolutely essential to bring massive air superiority to the South Pole. Why do you need air superiority to fight penguins and weather balloons? You do not. You need it if you're expecting to fight an enemy in the sky. Aboard these 13 massive ships were exactly 4,700 men. Think about that for a moment. 4,700 human beings, most of them young men who had just survived the horrors of World War II. These were sailors and marines who were expecting to be discharged, to go home, marry their sweethearts, and get a civilian job. Instead, they were handed heavy winter parkas loaded onto freezing steel ships and told they were sailing to the literal bottom of the earth. The logistical preparation required to keep these men alive was nothing short of a nightmare. Antarctica is not just cold. It is an alien environment that actively tries to destroy human machinery. When temperatures drop to 40, 50, or 60 degrees below 0 Fahrenheit, the physical rules of the world change. Standard military equipment simply stops working. Metal becomes brittle and can snap like dry wood if you hit it too hard. Rubber tires and hoses freeze solid and shatter like glass. The lubricating oil inside engines, gears, and guns turns into a thick, useless jelly. Therefore, every single piece of machinery, from the massive ship engines down to the smallest rifles and cameras, had to be completely winterized. They had to strip out the normal oil and replace it with special, experimental chemical lubricants that would not freeze. But the biggest challenge was the human fuel, food. You cannot forage for food in Antarctica. There are no trees, no plants, no crops. Every single calorie those 4,700 men were going to consume over the course of 6 to 8 months had to be packed into the cargo holds of those ships before they left the United States. We are talking about millions of pounds of food, mountains of canned beans, dehydrated eggs, frozen sides of beef, tons of coffee, and millions upon millions of cigarettes, which were considered an essential ration for the immense psychological stress the men were about to endure. The ships were packed so tight that sailors were sleeping on top of crates of ammunition and boxes of canned peaches. Then there was the air power. Admiral Byrd knew that the only way to cover the massive, unknown interior of Antarctica was from the sky. The fleet carried an impressive arsenal of aircraft, including a brand new cutting-edge piece of technology that most of the world had barely even seen yet, the helicopter. Helicopters were still in their absolute infancy in 1946, essentially flying mechanical grasshoppers that were incredibly difficult to fly. But Byrd brought them along to act as scouts, flying ahead of the massive ships to find safe paths through the deadly, shifting ice packs. More importantly, the fleet carried massive twin-engine flying boats called Martin PBM Mariners. These were huge, heavy aircraft designed to land right on the open ocean. However, the true heavy lifters were the 6 R-4D transport planes strapped to the deck of the USS Philippine Sea. These planes were enormous, and here is where the sheer madness of the mission becomes clear. The R-4D planes were too big to land back on the aircraft carrier once they took off, and they were too heavy to take off from the carrier's relatively short deck using only their propellers. So, how do you get a massive, heavy cargo plane to launch off a short ship deck in freezing weather? You use brute force. The Navy utilized a technology called JATO, which stands for Jet-Assisted Takeoff. To explain it simply, they essentially took massive steel bottles filled with solid rocket fuel, basically giant, controlled fireworks, and strapped them to the sides of the airplanes. When the pilot hit the throttle, he would ignite these rockets. The rockets would blast a trail of fire and thick, white smoke, forcefully, violently shoving the heavy airplane off the edge of the ship and into the sky before it could crash into the freezing ocean. Once these giant planes were in the air, they could never return to the ship. They had to fly over the continent, find a relatively flat piece of ice, and land on specialized skis. It was an incredibly dangerous one-way ticket off the boat. The timeline of Operation Highjump also raises massive red flags. Usually, a major military expedition takes years to plan. You have to design the equipment, train the men, and carefully map out every single logistical detail. But Task Force 68 was thrown together in an absolute frantic rush. The orders came down from the Chief of Naval Operations in August 1946, and the fleet was ordered to set sail by December of the exact same year. They had less than 4 months to assemble a massive fleet, heavily modify the ships, gather thousands of men, and sail out. Why the unbelievable rush? If this was truly just a scientific mission to test winter boots and map some ice, why could it not wait until the next year? Why the desperate scramble to get thousands of heavily armed men down to the South Pole immediately? Conspiracy theorists and historical researchers point to this rushing as proof that the United States had received actionable, terrifying intelligence. You only rush a massive military strike force if you believe the enemy is actively building a threat that cannot be allowed to finish. The urgency practically screamed that they were operating against a ticking clock. In December 1946, the massive steel leviathans of Task Force 68 finally pulled their anchors and steamed out of ports across the United States. The journey itself was a brutal test of endurance. To reach Antarctica, you have to cross a stretch of ocean at the very bottom of South America known as the Drake Passage. The Drake Passage is universally terrifying to sailors. It is the only place on Earth where the Atlantic, Pacific, and Southern Oceans violently smash into each other without any continents to slow the water down. It creates freak weather, howling gales, and monstrous waves that can easily reach the size of a 10-story building. The men aboard the smaller destroyers and submarines suffered through weeks of sheer torture. The ships violently pitched and rolled, rising massive heights on the crests of dark, freezing waves before slamming violently down into the troughs. Almost everyone was violently seasick. The decks were constantly coated in a lethal layer of slick, freezing sea spray. If a man slipped and fell overboard into those waters, he would be dead from hypothermia in less than 3 minutes. There was no turning around to save anyone. As the fleet finally pushed through the violent storms of the Drake Passage, the air grew noticeably colder. The grey skies turned a flat, blinding white. The radar operators sitting in the dark, warm bellies of the warships began to see massive, solid targets appearing on their green screens. These were not enemy ships, they were icebergs. Some were the size of small islands, floating silently in the black water, capable of sinking a destroyer in seconds. The tension across the fleet was palpable. The men stood on the freezing decks, their breath turning to steam, gripping the icy metal railings as they stared out into the endless, blinding white horizon. They had arrived at the ice wall. They had survived the ocean. They had brought the most advanced weapons of war known to man, and they were completely isolated from the rest of the world. Now it was time to push their massive steel armada deep into the ice, set up their bases, and launch their aircraft into the unknown. They were ready for whatever was waiting for them in the dark. But, as history would soon show, the ice was not empty, and the United States Navy was about to encounter something that their guns and rockets were completely powerless to stop. When the massive steel ships of Task Force 68 finally smashed their way through the outer rings of pack ice and arrived at the coast of Antarctica in late December of 1946, the reality of the situation immediately hit the men like a physical blow to the chest. They had successfully navigated the terrifying Drake Passage, but the ocean was no longer water. It was a grinding, crushing, unpredictable enemy of solid white. To understand what the fleet was facing, you have to understand that sea ice is not like an ice cube floating in your glass. Pack ice in the Antarctic is a violent, living thing. It is made up of thousands of massive, jagged chunks of frozen ocean, some as large as city blocks, constantly shifting, grinding, and smashing into each other, driven by deep underwater currents and howling surface winds. When these massive plates of ice collide, they push upward, creating massive, jagged pressure ridges that can tear a hole straight through the steel hull of a warship. Admiral Byrd divided his massive fleet into 3 separate groups to cover more ground: a central group, an eastern group, and a western group. The central group, which carried Byrd himself on the command ship USS Mount Olympus, was tasked with establishing the main base camp on the Ross Ice Shelf. They named it Little America 4. The physical labor required to build this base was agonizing. Thousands of sailors and Marines had to manually unload heavy tractors, steel runway mesh, and mountains of supplies onto the shifting ice in sub-zero temperatures. Men worked until their muscles cramped, their faces wrapped in heavy wool, struggling just to breathe the freezing air. But the United States Navy soon realized that all their heavy guns, their radar, and their thousands of troops were completely useless against the true master of the continent, the Antarctic weather. The weather was not just bad, it was actively trying to kill them every single second of the day. The pilots of the massive Martin PBM Mariner flying boats and the transport planes faced the most terrifying hazard of all, the whiteout. If you have never experienced a polar whiteout, it is a psychological and physical nightmare. Imagine taking a completely hollow, glowing white ping-pong ball and placing it directly over your eyes. That is what a whiteout looks like. The sky is a flat, blinding white. The ground is a flat, blinding white. The horizon line completely disappears. There are no shadows to tell you how high up you are or how fast you are moving. Pilots flying in a whiteout completely lose their sense of equilibrium. They do not know if they are flying straight, banking left, or plunging directly toward the ground. Their instruments become their only lifeline, but in the extreme magnetic fields near the poles, even compasses begin to spin wildly and become completely useless. On the fateful day of December 30th, 1946, exactly this kind of nightmare scenario struck the eastern group of the fleet. A massive PBM Mariner flying boat carrying the radio call sign George 1 was launched on a standard reconnaissance mission to map the unknown coastline. The massive plane, carrying a crew of 9 men, was soaring over a region of deep, uncharted ice when the weather suddenly and violently changed. Without warning, George 1 flew directly into a massive, blinding whiteout. Pilots were instantly blinded by a thick, freezing fog. The radar operator stared at his screen, but early 1940s radar had a fatal flaw in the polar regions. It could not effectively distinguish between a dense, freezing cloud bank and a solid mountain of ice covered in snow. To the radar, it all looked the same. The pilots, unable to see out the windows and trusting their flawed instruments, thought they were flying high above the ice. They were horribly wrong. The massive, heavy aircraft slammed violently into a hidden ridge of solid ice at high speed. The impact was catastrophic. The belly of the plane was ripped entirely open. The massive fuel tanks ruptured, immediately showering the aircraft in highly flammable aviation fuel, which instantly ignited. The plane cartwheeled across the ice, a massive ball of tearing metal and fire, before finally coming to a dead stop in the blinding snowstorm. Inside the burning wreckage, it was absolute chaos. 3 men, Ensign Maxwell Lopez, radio man Wendell Henderson, and flight engineer Frederick Williams, were killed instantly in the violent crash. The remaining 6 men, many of them severely burned, bleeding, and suffering from broken bones, had to drag themselves out of the flaming metal before it exploded. What followed was one of the most brutal and agonizing survival stories in the history of naval aviation. These 6 men were stranded in the absolute middle of nowhere, thousands of miles from civilization, sitting on an endless glacier. They had no radio, as it was destroyed in the crash. The temperature plummeted to well below freezing. For the next 13 days, these men huddled together in a small depression in the snow, using whatever scraps of canvas and unburned debris they could find to block the howling wind. They rationed a few pieces of frozen chocolate and canned meat. To signal for help, they painstakingly painted massive black flags using engine oil and tied them to the wreckage, hoping another plane would spot them against the endless white. Back at the fleet, the disappearance of George 1 sent a shock wave of dread through the thousands of men on the ships. It was a stark, horrifying reminder that despite their massive firepower, they were incredibly vulnerable. For nearly 2 weeks, rescue planes scoured the skies whenever the brutal weather allowed. Finally, by pure luck, another PBM Mariner spotted the blackened wreckage and the surviving men weakly waving their arms. The rescue of the George 1 crew was celebrated across the fleet But the joy was incredibly short-lived. The mood of Operation Highjump drastically, suddenly, and permanently shifted. According to the official naval schedule completely mapped out in Washington, D.C., Operation Highjump was designed to last for a minimum of 6 to 8 months. The fleet was supposed to stay through the entire Antarctic summer, mapping the coastline, establishing a permanent foothold, and completing an exhaustive list of scientific and military tests. But then, in late February and early March of 1947, just weeks after the operation had truly begun and the base camps were finally fully operational, Admiral Byrd suddenly issued an absolutely shocking order. Pack it up. Pack everything up right now. We are leaving. The entire 4,000-man armada was ordered to immediately abandon the ice and retreat to the open ocean. The suddenness of this evacuation was completely chaotic. Men were forced to leave behind millions of dollars worth of heavy equipment, tractors, and supplies simply because they did not have the time to load them back onto the ships. They left entire camps sitting on the ice, completely intact, like a ghost town frozen in time. The United States Navy's official public explanation for this massive, panicked retreat was the weather. The Navy claimed that the brutal Antarctic winter was setting in much earlier and much faster than their meteorologists had predicted. They stated that the pack ice was rapidly thickening and threatening to completely crush the thin-hulled ships, especially the unarmored cargo vessels and the massive aircraft carrier. To give credit to this official explanation, the ice was indeed becoming highly dangerous. The fleet's only submarine, the USS Senet, had already found itself completely trapped by the rapidly freezing pack ice. Submarines are entirely useless in heavy ice. If the surface freezes solid over them, they cannot surface to get fresh air or recharge their batteries. The Navy had to send massive, heavy icebreakers to physically ram their way through the ice to drag the helpless submarine out to safety before it was crushed like an empty soda can. But for decades, researchers, historians, and the men who actually sailed on those ships have intensely questioned this official story. Was it truly just an early winter that chased the most powerful navy on Earth away from the South Pole? The math simply does not add up. The United States military is meticulous when it comes to planning. They had decades of polar weather data, including Admiral Byrd's own extensive personal records from his previous expeditions. They knew exactly how the Antarctic seasons worked. You do not spend millions of dollars, pull thousands of men away from their families, and sail across the entire globe just to get spooked by a little extra ice and run away after a few weeks. Furthermore, massive rumors began to circulate among the sailors and eventually leaked to the public. These whispers claimed that the crash of George I was not the only casualty. There were dark, persistent rumors of other aircraft launching from the USS Philippine Sea and simply vanishing into the whiteout, never to be heard from again. There were rumors of ships suffering mysterious, unexplainable damage that went far beyond simply bumping into icebergs. The overall feeling among the crew during the Frantic retreat was not one of a successful scientific mission wrapping up early. It was the feeling of an army that had been thoroughly beaten. They felt as though they had kicked a hornet's nest in the dark and were now running for their lives before the swarm could fully descend upon them. They had gone to Antarctica looking for answers, perhaps looking for the rumored secret bases of a defeated enemy, and the abrupt, panicked nature of their withdrawal suggested to many that they had actually found exactly what they were looking for, and they were completely terrified by it. As the heavily battered, freezing fleet pushed its way back through the treacherous waters of the Drake Passage, leaving the icy continent behind, the world demanded to know what had happened. Why did the great Admiral Byrd turn tail and run? The silence from the military was deafening, but Admiral Byrd himself was not entirely silent. On his journey back to the United States, the fleet made a stop in the country of Chile, and it was there, in a seemingly ordinary newspaper interview, that the hero of the American Navy would drop a bombshell quote that would echo through history and cement the terrifying legacy of Operation Highjump forever. As the bruised, battered and freezing ships of Task Force 68 finally limped out of the Antarctic ice pack and into the slightly warmer waters of the South Pacific Ocean, the mood aboard the fleet was incredibly heavy. Thousands of sailors and Marines had just survived a brutal, terrifying ordeal. They had lost aircraft, they had lost men, and they were retreating months ahead of schedule. As they sailed northward, making their way toward South America, the world's press was desperately waiting for answers. Why did the largest naval expedition in polar history turn around and run away? In early March of 1947, the command ship, the USS Mount Olympus, made a port call in Valparaiso, Chile. It was meant to be a simple stop to refuel, restock fresh food, and allow the exhausted men to step on solid ground for the first time in months. But it was during this brief stopover that Admiral Richard E. Byrd gave an interview that would completely change the way the world looked at Operation Highjump. This interview did not take place in a dark, smoky room with anonymous conspiracy theorists. It was a formal press briefing given to a highly respected journalist named Lee Van Atta, who was traveling with the expedition as a correspondent for the International News Service. On March 5, 1947, the prestigious Chilean newspaper El Mercurio published the interview. In this completely public, historically documented article, Admiral Byrd dropped a psychological nuclear bomb. He did not talk about testing winter boots. He did not talk about mapping icebergs. Instead, he issued a dire, terrifying warning to the United States and the entire free world. The quote, translated directly from the Spanish publication, reads as follows: Admiral Byrd declared today that it was imperative for the United States to initiate immediate defense measures against hostile regions. The Admiral further stated that he didn't want to frighten anyone unduly, but it was a bitter reality that in case of a new war, the continental United States would be attacked by flying objects which could fly from pole to pole at incredible speeds. Let us pause for a moment and truly dissect this incredible statement. To understand just how shocking and bizarre this quote is, we have to look horizontally at the state of human technology in the year 1947. In 1947, commercial aviation was slow, loud, and uncomfortable. People were flying in propeller-driven airplanes that essentially looked like shiny metal cigars with wings. The absolute cutting edge of military technology at the time was the very first generation of jet fighters like the American P-80 Shooting Star or the German Me-262 from the end of World War II. These early jets were incredibly dangerous to fly, consumed massive amounts of fuel, and had a very limited range. They could fly fast, but they could only fly fast for a few hundred miles before they had to land and refuel. Therefore, the concept of a flying object that could travel from pole to pole at incredible speeds was not just advanced technology. To the average person reading the newspaper in 1947, it was pure, unadulterated science fiction. The distance from the North Pole to the South Pole is roughly 12,400 miles. To fly that distance without stopping at speeds faster than anything the United States military possessed required a propulsion system and an energy source that officially did not exist on planet Earth. So, why would Admiral Byrd, a man of profound logic, a decorated war hero and a meticulous scientific observer, say something that sounded so completely crazy? Remember what we established in Part 1. Byrd was not a man prone to exaggeration or panic. He survived months alone in a freezing, toxic hut and kept perfectly accurate weather logs while slowly dying. If a man with his rock-solid credibility stares into the camera and says that America needs to prepare for an attack by transpolar flying objects, you have to assume that he saw something that completely shattered his understanding of reality. The immediate question that swept through military intelligence agencies was obvious. Who was the enemy? Who possessed these flying objects? If you look at the geopolitical chessboard of 1947, the most logical, earthly answer would be the Soviet Union. The Cold War was just beginning, and the fear of Soviet bombers flying over the North Pole to drop atomic bombs on American City was a very real, growing nightmare for the Pentagon. But in the context of Operation Highjump, the Soviet theory completely falls apart. In 1947, the Soviet Navy was practically non-existent in the deep oceans. They had absolutely no presence in Antarctica, no bases, and zero capability to manufacture aircraft that could fly from the South Pole to the United States. Furthermore, if Byrd was simply worried about Russian bombers in the Arctic, why would he issue this panicked warning immediately after retreating from the Antarctic? The geography simply does not make sense. This brings us to the second, much darker theory, which connects directly back to the chilling rumors we explored in Part 2. Did Admiral Byrd and Task Force 68 actually stumble upon the remnants of the Third Reich? Did they find Base 211 hidden beneath the ice of New Swabia? By 1947, the United States military knew perfectly well that German scientists had been working on incredibly bizarre, highly advanced aerospace designs before their empire collapsed. When the Allies pushed into Germany, they found blueprints and prototypes for weapons that looked completely alien. They found the Horten HO-229, a jet-powered aircraft that was essentially a giant, smooth, flying batwing with no tail, completely defying traditional airplane shapes. Even more terrifying were the rumors of Die Glocke, or the Bell, and the Haunebu projects. According to persistent military folklore, these were experimental aircraft shaped exactly like massive metal saucers, allegedly utilizing anti-gravity technology or advanced magnetic propulsion systems. If you try to picture this scenario in your mind, it plays out like a blockbuster movie. The massive American fleet pushes its way into the Antarctic ice, expecting to easily clear out a few freezing, stranded enemy submarines. Instead, they are suddenly swarmed by perfectly silent, glowing metal discs that move at impossible speeds, effortlessly dodging American anti-aircraft fire and knocking the heavy PBM Mariner flying boats out of the sky with terrifying ease. If Byrd encountered a technologically superior breakaway faction of the enemy he thought had been defeated 2 years prior, a faction that possessed flying saucers completely immune to traditional weapons, his panicked retreat and his frantic warning to the press in Chile make perfect, terrifying sense. But there is a third theory. It is a theory that goes far beyond the politics of the Cold War and the ashes of World War II. It is a theory that suggests Admiral Byrd encountered an enemy or perhaps a completely unknown civilization that had been on this planet long before human beings even learned how to build ships. What if the incredible flying machines he warned the world about were not made by the Soviets, and they were not made by escaping German scientists? What if they were operated by something completely indigenous to the deepest, most hidden corners of the Earth? The moment the El Mercurio article hit the wire services and began circulating, the reaction from the United States government was swift, brutal, and absolute. The military establishment in Washington, D.C. was absolutely furious. You do not send your most famous admiral on a highly publicized, multi-million-dollar military expedition only to have him return and tell the world that the most powerful nation on Earth is completely defenseless against a mysterious, technologically superior enemy. It was a massive public relations disaster, and it risked spreading sheer panic among the American population. Upon his return to the United States, Admiral Byrd was immediately ushered into top-secret, closed-door meetings at the Pentagon. The official records of these briefings remain heavily classified or simply missing to this day. But the result of these meetings was perfectly clear to the public. The hero of the polls, the man who had always been completely transparent about his adventures and scientific discoveries, was immediately and forcefully silenced. He was ordered never to speak publicly about the details of Operation Highjump again. He was told to never repeat his warnings about flying objects or transpolar threats. The United States government officially closed the book on the expedition, labeling it a successful equipment test, and demanded that the world move on. For nearly a decade, Admiral Byrd obeyed those orders. He faded from the public spotlight, remaining a respected but strangely quiet figure in the military establishment. The ice of Antarctica was left alone, guarded by a massive treaty that essentially banned any large military operations on the continent. It seemed that whatever had terrified Task Force 68 in 1947 was going to remain completely buried under the snow forever. However, secrets as massive as the ones hiding at the bottom of the world cannot be kept locked away forever. Admiral Byrd was a man who deeply believed in the truth, and while he was forbidden to speak to the press, he never stopped writing in his personal journals. The story of Operation Highjump is merely the violent, explosive prologue to the true mystery. Because the actual mind-bending truth of what Admiral Byrd saw, the true nature of the flying objects and the completely impossible world hiding beyond the ice, would not be fully revealed until a highly classified solo flight almost 10 years later in 1956. This flight would lead to the creation of the most controversial, unbelievable, and heavily suppressed document in modern history, the secret diary of Admiral Richard E. Byrd. For nearly a decade after the sudden, panicked retreat of Operation Highjump, an uncomfortable silence settled over the frozen continent of Antarctica. Admiral Richard E. Byrd, the great American hero, had been effectively muzzled by his own government. The terrifying warning he issued to the press in South America about flying objects capable of traveling from pole to pole had been completely scrubbed from official military dialogue. Outwardly, Byrd returned to his duties as a highly decorated, highly respected naval officer. But behind closed doors, the mystery of what he truly experienced in the ice gnawed at him. The story takes a massive cinematic leap forward to the year 1956. The geopolitical landscape of the world had grown even more tense, and the United States military decided it was finally time to return to the absolute bottom of the Earth. They launched Operation Deep Freeze. Officially, this was part of the International Geophysical Year, a massive, globally coordinated scientific effort to study the Earth's environment. The military established permanent research stations, including the famous McMurdo Station, which still exists today. Because of his unparalleled experience, Admiral Byrd was once again placed in charge of the American efforts, though this time his role was slightly more administrative. He was an older man now, a veteran of countless brutal campaigns against the extreme cold. But Byrd was not a man who could simply sit behind a desk and read weather reports while the greatest mystery of his life remained unsolved out on the ice. In January of 1956, Admiral Byrd boarded a twin-engine transport plane for a deep penetration flight into the totally unexplored interior of the continent. He was accompanied by his trusted radio operator. This specific flight is the exact moment where the established, official historical record ends and the terrifying, reality-bending contents of his alleged secret diary begin. The diary, which mysteriously surfaced years after his death, details a sequence of events so incredibly bizarre that the military establishment spent decades trying to convince the public it was a complete forgery. But if you read the diary closely, it reads exactly like the meticulous clinical logbook of a trained military observer trying to rationally process an impossible situation. According to the diary, the flight began as a completely standard, mundane polar operation. The twin engines of the aircraft hummed perfectly. For the first few hours, looking out the cockpit windows, there was nothing to see but an endless, blinding white ocean of ice and snow stretching out to a perfectly flat horizon. Byrd noted in his logbook that the weather was clear, the visibility was excellent, and the radio checks with the main base camp were coming through loud and clear. They were flying over an area of the Earth that had never been seen by human eyes, a massive blank spot on the map. Then, exactly as the aircraft pushed deeper into the unknown interior, the normalcy of the flight violently shattered. It started with the instruments. Byrd wrote that without any warning, the magnetic compass mounted on the dashboard began to behave erratically. It did not just drift, it started spinning wildly in complete circles like a child's toy top. To understand how terrifying this is for a pilot, you have to understand a simple fact of navigation. A compass works by locking onto the invisible magnetic fields generated by the Earth's core. In the extreme polar regions, magnetic fields can get slightly confused, and pilots know how to calculate for this minor drift. But a compass spinning wildly out of control means that the fundamental magnetic physics of the area you are flying through have completely broken down. It means there is a massive, localized magnetic anomaly throwing out energy so powerful that it overwhelms the Earth's natural poles. Moments later, the gyroscopic compass, a heavy, spinning mechanical instrument that relies on the physical rotation of the Earth to find true north and is completely immune to magnetic interference, began to violently oscillate back and forth. The aircraft was suddenly flying completely blind. They had no idea which direction they were pointing. Byrd's radio operator immediately grabbed his microphone to send a distress signal back to the base camp. He desperately squeezed the transmission button, calling out for an emergency fix on their position. But the radio was completely dead. It was not a mechanical failure. The headset was entirely filled with a thick, heavy, suffocating static. It sounded as if a massive blanket of electronic interference had been suddenly dropped right over their airplane. They were completely cut off from the rest of the human race, flying over a frozen wasteland with no navigation and no way to call for help. If you are a normal pilot, this is the exact moment you turn the airplane around, follow your own contrail back the way you came, and pray you do not crash. But Byrd was an explorer to his core. Despite the sheer panic of complete instrument failure, he kept his hands steady on the yoke and pushed the twin-engine plane forward. As they continued, the physical environment outside the cockpit windows began to change in ways that defied every known law of nature. The diary notes a strange, unnatural shift in the lighting. The harsh, blinding white glare of the sun reflecting off the polar ice suddenly faded. The sky completely lost its pale blue color and shifted into a bizarre, glowing yellowish hue. It was not the light of a setting sun. It was as if the entire atmosphere around them had changed its chemical composition, glowing with a soft, radiant golden light. Then the ice completely disappeared. Looking down, Byrd expected to see the familiar, deadly, grinding pressure ridges of the Antarctic glaciers. Instead, he saw a massive mountain range rising up from the ground below. These were not the ice-covered, jagged peaks normally found in Antarctica. These mountains were dark, rocky, and completely devoid of snow. Byrd pushed the yoke forward, gently dropping the altitude of the heavy airplane to get a closer look. He thought he was suffering from extreme snow blindness or a lack of oxygen. He rapidly checked his altitude, but they were flying low enough to see perfect, impossible details. As the plane crested the rocky peaks of the mysterious mountain range, the true scale of the anomaly revealed itself. Nestled directly behind the mountains, completely surrounded by thousands of miles of the coldest, deadliest ice on the planet, was a massive, sprawling, lush, green valley. The diary entries from this moment read with a tone of absolute, staggering disbelief. Byrd described seeing a thick, vibrant green forest growing on the slopes of the valley. Through the center of the greenery flowed a completely liquid, sparkling blue river catching the strange, yellowish light from the sky above. To put this into perspective, finding a thriving green jungle in the center of the Antarctic continent is physically impossible. It is a place where the average temperature is well below 0 degrees, where the ground is a solid block of permafrost miles deep, and where the sun disappears completely for 6 months out of the year. Plants cannot grow without sunlight, and liquid rivers cannot flow in sub-zero temperatures. Yet, the physical evidence inside the cockpit proved that they were not hallucinating. Byrd glanced over at the aircraft's external temperature gauge. When they took off, the outside air temperature was dozens of degrees below 0. Now, as they flew low over the green canopy of the trees, the needle on the thermometer was steadily climbing. It hit 40 degrees, then 50, then 60. Finally, the needle stopped dead at a staggering 74 degrees Fahrenheit. 74 degrees. It was a perfectly comfortable, warm spring day. Inside the cockpit, Byrd and his radio man were heavily dressed in thick, wool-lined polar survival suits designed to keep them from freezing to death. Now they were profusely sweating. They had to frantically unzip their heavy jackets and pull off their fur-lined gloves just to avoid overheating. They had literally flown out of the harshest winter on Earth and crossed a completely invisible threshold into a hidden tropical paradise. Byrd banked the airplane sharply, making wide circles over the valley floor, furiously writing down everything he saw. He noted that the light seemed to be coming from everywhere at once, casting almost no shadows. It was a perfectly sustained, artificial-feeling climate, completely shielded from the howling blizzards raging just a few miles away on the other side of the Rocky Mountains. Then the diary reveals the most shocking observation of the entire flight. As the airplane flew low over the green fields bordering the river, Byrd saw movement. It was not the wind blowing through the trees. It was a massive, living creature. Byrd grabbed a pair of heavy military binoculars from the dashboard and pressed them to his eyes, tracking the animal as it moved slowly through the tall grass. It was enormous, covered entirely in a thick, shaggy coat of dark brown hair. It had a massive, sloping back and two incredibly long, curved tusks protruding from its face. The Admiral's hands began to shake. He was looking directly at an animal that had been officially extinct for more than 10,000 years. It was a woolly mammoth, a creature from the Pleistocene epoch, the Great Ice Age, was casually grazing in a warm green meadow in the absolute center of the Antarctic continent. At this precise moment in the diary, the tone shifts from one of scientific curiosity to absolute, mind-numbing shock. Byrd realized that they had not just discovered a geological anomaly, they had discovered a completely preserved, perfectly hidden, prehistoric terrarium. They had flown over an invisible boundary and entered a place that time and the rest of the world had completely forgotten. He frantically ordered his radio man to try the emergency frequencies one more time, desperate to report this monumental, history-shattering discovery back to the command base. But the headset remained completely silent, filled only with the heavy, mocking hiss of static. They were entirely alone in an impossible world. Byrd turned his attention back to the flight controls, preparing to make another low pass over the grazing mammoth to get a better look at the massive beast. He gripped the yoke, his heart pounding heavily against his ribs, sweating inside his heavy polar gear. But as he leveled the wings of the airplane, he suddenly caught a flash of bright, metallic light out of the corner of his eye. He looked out the side window of the cockpit, expecting to see a reflection of a hidden lake or perhaps a strange weather balloon. Instead, what he saw flying in tight formation directly alongside his left wing would completely shatter his understanding of human history, physics, and his place in the universe. The impossible Green Valley and the prehistoric mammoth were merely the welcome mat. The true masters of this hidden world had arrived to escort him in. As Admiral Byrd banked his heavy twin-engine transport plane to get a second closer look at the impossible prehistoric beast grazing in the green valley below, a sudden flash of brilliant metallic light caught the corner of his eye. His immediate instinct as a seasoned military pilot was to check for a wingman. Perhaps another aircraft from the United States Navy fleet had somehow managed to break through the massive magnetic interference and had come to rescue him. He turned his head and looked out the left window of the cockpit, expecting to see the familiar olive-drab painted metal and the spinning propellers of a Martin PBM Mariner. What he actually saw, flying in a tight, perfect formation directly alongside his left wing, immediately shattered every single rule of aviation, physics, and reality that he had ever known. Hovering just a few dozen yards away was a flying machine that looked like absolutely nothing built by human hands in the year 1956. There were no wings. There were no massive spinning propeller blades chopping through the air. There were no exhaust pipes vomiting black smoke and fire, and there was absolutely no engine noise. It was a perfectly smooth, disc-shaped craft, essentially looking like two shallow metal bowls pressed together at the rims. The surface of the craft was a gleaming, polished silver that seemed to actively radiate its own soft light, reflecting the bizarre yellowish hue of the artificial sky above them. Byrd's radio man let out a sharp gasp of sheer terror. Suddenly, a second, identical metallic disc dropped from the sky above and seamlessly locked into formation on the right side of the airplane. The two mysterious craft had the American transport plane completely boxed in. They were flying incredibly close, moving with a fluid, effortless grace that completely defied aerodynamics. When a traditional airplane flies, it has to constantly fight the wind, bouncing and shuddering through pockets of turbulence. But these silver discs simply glided through the air as if they were sliding on invisible sheets of glass. As Byrd stared in absolute shock at the craft on his right, he noticed something painted on the smooth metal hull. It was a marking, a symbol. In his secret diary, Byrd described it as a symbol that chilled his blood, though the exact nature of the symbol has been debated for decades. Some interpretations of his notes suggest it looked terrifyingly similar to a swastika, immediately bringing back the horrifying rumors of the fleeing German scientists and their secret base 211 in New Swabia. Other versions suggest the symbols were ancient, unknown runes, looking more like ancient Sanskrit or a language that predated human civilization entirely. Regardless of what the symbol truly was, the message was instantly clear. This was not a natural phenomenon, and the Admiral was no longer the one in control. Panic, cold and sharp, finally pierced through Byrd's incredible military discipline. He realized he was being intercepted. He immediately grabbed the heavy yoke of the airplane with both hands, intending to throw the heavy transport plane into a steep, evasive dive to escape the two strange machines. He stomped down hard on the rudder pedals. Nothing happened. The controls were totally frozen. It was not a mechanical failure where the cables snap and the plane goes loose. It was exactly the opposite. The steering yoke was locked rigidly in place as if it had been suddenly encased in a solid block of concrete. Byrd pulled backward with all of his formidable upper body strength, his muscles straining, sweating profusely inside his heavy winter gear, but the wheel refused to move even a fraction of an inch. To understand what was happening to the airplane, you do not need a degree in quantum physics. Think of a very simple, everyday object, a magnet. Imagine you have a small metal toy car rolling across a table. Now imagine taking a massive, incredibly powerful industrial magnet and hovering it just an inch above that toy car. The magnetic field violently grabs the metal of the toy, completely stopping its forward momentum, holding it suspended in an invisible, unbreakable grip. You can push the toy all you want, but the invisible force field is infinitely stronger than your hands. This is exactly what the two silver discs had done to a massive, multi-ton military aircraft. They had caught the airplane in an invisible, perfectly calibrated magnetic tractor beam. Byrd and his radio man were now captives, suspended in mid-air, completely powerless. Then the situation escalated from terrifying to utterly surreal. The heavy, suffocating wall of static that had completely killed their radio communications suddenly broke. A sharp, clear crackle echoed through the headset in Byrd's helmet. It was not the desperate, frantic voice of an American radio operator back at the main ice camp. It was a voice that was perfectly calm, melodic, and strangely authoritative. And most shockingly of all, it was speaking directly to him in perfect English, though Byrd noted it had a very slight, almost unplaceable Nordic or Germanic accent. "We welcome you to our domain, Admiral," the voice stated smoothly through the radio. "We shall land you in exactly 7 minutes. Relax, Admiral. You are in excellent hands." Byrd sat frozen in his pilot's seat. The voice knew his rank. It knew who he was. He was an admiral of the United States Navy, a man used to giving orders to thousands of heavily armed troops, and now he was being told to simply relax by an unseen, technologically supreme entity. Immediately following that transmission, the massive twin engines of Byrd's airplane simply stopped. They did not sputter, cough, or choke on fuel. The mechanical roar that had filled the cockpit for hours instantly died, replaced by an eerie, terrifying silence. The propellers slowly wound down until they stopped spinning entirely. In any normal aviation scenario, when a heavy cargo plane loses both of its engines at a low altitude, it becomes a multi-ton brick. It will drop out of the sky and smash into the ground in a matter of seconds. But Byrd's airplane did not drop. The invisible magnetic force holding the plane simply took over completely. The silver discs on either side of the wings gently began to guide the dead, silent airplane forward and downward, acting like two invisible tugboats guiding a massive ship into a harbor. As they were pulled smoothly over the top of the lush green forest canopy, the landscape ahead suddenly opened up, revealing a massive, sprawling valley floor. And there, shining in the bizarre, golden artificial light, was a sight so breathtaking and alien that Byrd could barely find the words to describe it in his journal. It was a city, but it was not a city of concrete, steel, and black asphalt like New York, London, or Chicago. If you looked at a human city in the 1940s from the sky, you saw sharp, ugly 90-degree angles. You saw massive smokestacks pumping thick, black smog into the air. You saw rigid grids of streets packed with noisy, gas-burning cars. Human cities look like scars carved forcefully into the natural earth. This city was the exact opposite. It seemed as though it had organically grown straight out of the lush, green ground. The architecture was completely devoid of sharp angles. Instead, the buildings were shaped like massive, elegant domes, soaring arches, and smooth, sweeping curves. And the materials were entirely incomprehensible. The structures were not made of dead grey concrete. They seemed to be constructed from a completely seamless, translucent material that looked exactly like brilliantly polished crystal. As the invisible force carried the dead airplane closer, the city seemed to literally pulse with color. The smooth, glass-like walls of the massive domes caught the golden light from above and fractured it into a million different shades of the rainbow. It looked like a city constructed entirely out of glowing, multicolored diamonds. There were no smokestacks, no visible power plants, no factories, and absolutely no pollution. The air outside the cockpit window remained perfectly clear. It was a metropolis that existed in total, flawless harmony with the incredibly lush, green, prehistoric nature surrounding it. It looked exactly like the conceptual drawings of a perfect utopian society from the 25th century, or perhaps a mythical realm straight out of the oldest legends of humanity. Byrd watched, totally mesmerized, as his silent airplane was gently pulled toward the very center of the glowing crystal city. They were descending rapidly now, gliding over the sparkling domes and perfectly manicured, glowing green parks. Directly ahead, a massive, flat, glowing platform seemed to rise slightly from the ground. It was not a runway of black tarmac. It was a smooth, radiant landing pad that looked as though it was made of solid, glowing marble. The two silver discs flanking the airplane suddenly broke their tight formation. They smoothly peeled away, accelerating upward into the golden sky at a speed so incredible they simply vanished into thin air in a fraction of a second, completely defying the laws of inertia and gravity. But the magnetic grip on Byrd's airplane remained perfectly stable. The plane continued its silent, engineless descent. Byrd braced himself for a rough landing, tightly gripping the armrests of his chair. He expected the heavy landing gear to slam violently against the solid platform. Instead, the massive airplane touched the ground with the gentle, perfect softness of a feather landing on a pillow. There was almost no physical jolt whatsoever. The invisible force simply placed the multi-ton machine safely on the glowing platform and released its grip. The aircraft rolled forward for a few dozen yards and came to a perfectly smooth, completely silent halt. For a long, heavy moment, there was absolute silence inside the cockpit. Admiral Byrd and his radio man sat perfectly still, listening to the sound of their own frantic breathing. They had successfully crossed the frozen hell of Antarctica, passed through an invisible barrier, flown over an extinct mammoth, and had just been safely landed in a glowing crystal city by flying saucers. Then Byrd looked out the front windshield. Approaching the front of the airplane were several figures. They were not green aliens with massive black eyes, nor were they heavily armed Nazi stormtroopers wearing swastika armbands. As they walked closer, with a calm, unhurried, and elegant stride, Byrd realized that they were entirely, perfectly human. They were exceptionally tall, standing well over 6 feet, and completely physically flawless. They wore simple, beautifully woven, seamless garments that clung gracefully to their athletic bodies. They had pale skin and striking, brilliantly blonde hair. But the most important detail was their hands. They were not carrying rifles, laser weapons, or any military equipment of any kind. Their hands were empty, and their faces carried expressions of profound, genuine warmth and peace. They were not an arresting squad coming to take prisoners of war. They were a welcoming committee. As one of the tall, blonde figures stepped up to the side door of the transport plane and gently signaled for the humans to open it, Admiral Byrd realized that his mission of exploration was completely over. He was no longer the commander of Operation Highjump. He was now an invited guest, a messenger about to be brought face to face with the true rulers of the Earth, and he was about to receive a warning that the surface world desperately needed to hear. The heavy metal door of the military transport plane swung open, and for the first time in months, Admiral Richard E. Byrd stepped out of his aircraft without wearing his heavy, fur-lined polar survival gear. As his boots touched the smooth, glowing surface of the landing platform, he braced himself for a blast of freezing Antarctic wind. Instead, the air that hit his face was incredibly warm, soft, and fragrant. It smelled intensely of sweet spring rain and blooming flowers. It was the smell of a perfectly healthy, thriving ecosystem, completely devoid of the sharp sting of airplane exhaust, diesel fuel, or the metallic scent of war that he was so used to. Two of the tall, beautifully athletic, blonde-haired figures walked slowly toward him. As they drew close, Byrd could see that their eyes were a piercing, vibrant shade of blue, radiating a sense of absolute calm. One of them raised a hand in a simple gesture of peace and spoke in a voice that was highly melodic, carrying that same faint, unplaceable Nordic accent he had heard over the radio. "Welcome to our territory, Admiral," the man said warmly. "Please, leave your radio man here with the aircraft. He will be provided with food and water. You must come with us. The master has been expecting you." Byrd nodded. As a lifelong military commander, he knew when he was outranked, and in this glowing, impossible city, he was entirely at their mercy. He left his terrified radio man behind and followed his two silent escorts. They did not walk far. Parked just at the edge of the landing platform was a small, flat vehicle that looked exactly like a completely smooth, hovering sled. There were no wheels touching the ground, no steering wheel, and no visible engine. It was simply a beautifully carved slab of that same translucent crystal-like material floating completely silently about 2 feet in the air. Byrd stepped onto the platform with his escorts. Instantly, the vehicle began to glide forward at a rapid, yet perfectly smooth pace. As they traveled deeper into the city, Byrd's mind struggled to comprehend what he was seeing. There were no paved roads cutting through the landscape. There were no power lines, no streetlights, and absolutely no vehicles that ran on burning fuel. People were walking peacefully along beautiful, winding pathways surrounded by incredibly lush, vibrant gardens. The massive, towering crystal domes that made up the city's buildings seemed to literally glow from the inside out, pulsing with the same soft, golden light that filled the artificial sky. It was a civilization that had completely bypassed the messy, dirty, and violent industrial revolution of the surface world. They had somehow learned to harness the natural, invisible energies of the earth itself. It was absolute, perfect harmony. The hovering sled finally came to a gentle halt in front of the largest and most magnificent building in the entire city. It was a colossal, soaring structure that looked like a cathedral made entirely of woven light and spun glass. Massive doors, completely devoid of hinges or handles, seamlessly slid open as Byrd approached. He was escorted down a long, echoing hallway lit by a brilliant, soft light that seemed to emanate directly from the walls themselves. Finally, they entered a massive, circular chamber. The room was breathtaking in its simplicity. There were no grand thrones, no military banners, and no guards holding weapons. At the very center of the room sat a long, beautifully carved table made of a dark, rich wood that Byrd had never seen before. Sitting at the far end of the table was a single figure. As Byrd approached, his escort stopped at the doorway, indicating that he should go forward alone. Byrd walked slowly toward the table. The man sitting there did not look like a terrifying alien warlord, nor did he look like a mystical, glowing deity. He looked like an exceptionally old, yet incredibly vital human being. His hair was completely white, cascading softly over his shoulders, and his face was etched with the deep lines of immense age and profound experience. But it was his eyes that completely captivated Byrd. They were dark, endless, and filled with a heavy, ancient wisdom that made Byrd feel entirely transparent, as if this man could read his entire life story with a single glance. "Sit down, Admiral," the old man said gently. His voice was soft, yet it resonated with an undeniable quiet power that commanded absolute respect. Byrd took a seat in a comfortable chair opposite the old man. For a moment, there was a heavy, pregnant silence in the massive, glowing room. "You are probably wondering why you are here," the old man began, leaning forward slightly. "I am called the Master. You have been brought here into the realm of Agartha, the inner world of the earth, because you are a man of high and noble character, and you are well known on the surface world." Byrd swallowed hard, trying to maintain his military composure. "The surface world?" he asked quietly. "Yes," the Master replied, his expression growing deeply serious. "For thousands of years, my people, the Flugelrads, have lived here in complete peace. We have watched your race on the surface evolve. We watched you build your empires, fight your bloody wars with swords and arrows, and slowly develop your noisy, smoking machines. Through all of your history, we have never interfered. We kept to ourselves, safe beneath the ice and the crust of the earth. We considered your wars to be the foolish games of children, and we believed you would eventually grow out of them." The Master paused, and a look of profound sorrow crossed his ancient face. He looked directly into Byrd's eyes, and the temperature in the room seemed to drop. "But then the year 1945 arrived on your calendar," the Master continued, his voice hardening. "We watched in horror as your military scientists unleashed a power that was never meant for the hands of men. You unlocked the secrets of the atom, and you used it to build bombs. You dropped those bombs on the cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki." To explain this to the viewers simply, the Master was not talking about a bigger cannon or a faster airplane. He was talking about the fundamental building blocks of the universe. When humanity learned to split the atom, they essentially learned how to pull a piece of the burning sun down to Earth. It was a completely unnatural, world-breaking fire. To the advanced, peaceful beings of Agartha, seeing humans use atomic weapons was exactly like watching a screaming toddler suddenly find a loaded machine gun in a playroom. It was no longer just a local danger, it was an existential threat to the entire planet. "That was the turning point," the Master said heavily. "The moment those blinding flashes of atomic light scorched your surface world, it sent shock waves deep into our realm. We realized that your race had crossed a line. You had discovered a force capable of not just destroying yourselves, but destroying the entire Earth, including us. That is why we finally decided to reveal ourselves." Byrd listened in stunned silence. The puzzle pieces of the last few years began to violently snap together in his mind. "We sent our flying machines, the craft you call our Flugelrads, to the surface world to investigate the fallout of your atomic explosions," the Master explained. "We flew over your military bases and your cities, trying to gauge the sanity of your leaders, but instead of welcoming us, your military forces panicked. They fired upon our peaceful craft with anti-aircraft guns. They chased our pilots with fighter planes, acting out of sheer primitive aggression. This entirely explained the frantic, massive military build-up of Operation Highjump. The United States government hadn't been hunting German submarines. They had been hunting the very craft that belonged to this ancient subterranean civilization, completely terrified by a technology they could not control. "Admiral," the Master said, his tone shifting into a grave, terrifying prophecy, "I must warn you, your civilization is rapidly approaching a massive, unstoppable storm. You are entering a dark age. Your nations are splitting into factions, hoarding these atomic weapons, pointing them at each other out of fear and greed. You possess the scientific technology of gods, but you possess the emotional and spiritual maturity of angry, selfish children." The master raised a hand, gesturing as if to encompass the entire globe above them. When this storm finally breaks, your weapons will not simply destroy an opposing army, they will scorch the entire surface of the earth. There will be no winners. Your great cities will be reduced to radioactive glass and ash. The beautiful green surface of your world will become a dead, silent graveyard for thousands of years. Byrd felt a cold sweat break out on his forehead. The sheer, overwhelming truth of the old man's words was undeniable. The Cold War was just beginning, and the frantic race to build bigger and more destructive nuclear weapons was already the absolute priority of the Pentagon. "Why are you telling me this?" Byrd finally asked, his voice trembling slightly. "I am just a sailor. I am an explorer. I do not control the military." The master smiled, a sad, gentle expression. "We chose you, Admiral Byrd, because your people trust you. You are considered a hero. When a politician speaks, people look for the lie. When an explorer of your caliber speaks, people listen. We brought you here so that you could see with your own eyes that our world exists, that our power is absolute, and that our warning is real. We will not allow your race to destroy this planet." The master stood up from the long wooden table, signaling that the audience was over. "You must return to the surface world," the master commanded softly. "You must carry this message directly to your leaders in Washington. Tell them they must stop this madness. Tell them they must dismantle their atomic weapons and learn to live in peace. If they do not, the Dark Age will consume them entirely, and the surface world will be lost." The old man extended his hand, and Byrd, acting entirely on pure instinct, reached out and shook it. The master's grip was surprisingly firm, radiating a deep, comforting warmth. "Farewell, Admiral. May you find the courage to speak the truth," the master said. Before Byrd could ask another question, the two tall, blonde escorts silently appeared at the doorway. They gently guided him out of the massive, glowing crystal chamber, back down the soft, radiant hallways, and out to the hovering sled. As Byrd rode back through the perfect, harmonious city, his mind was spinning violently. He had flown into the ice looking for geographic anomalies, and instead he was flying out as a prophet carrying a message of global doom. He knew exactly what the men in the Pentagon would say when he told them they needed to drop their weapons and embrace peace because an ancient man inside the hollow earth told him so. They would think he had completely lost his mind. But as he approached his silent, waiting transport plane, seeing his radio man frantically waving at him from the glowing marble platform, Admiral Richard E. Byrd made a silent vow. He would not hide what he had seen. He would take the master's warning directly to the President of the United States, regardless of the consequences. He climbed back into the freezing cockpit of his aircraft, preparing to be launched back into the violent, cold reality of the surface world, completely unaware of the massive wall of absolute military censorship that was already waiting to crush him into silence. If you are hearing the story of Admiral Byrd's incredible flight for the very first time, your logical modern brain is likely screaming right now. We have all been taught in school that the Earth is essentially a massive, solid ball of rock. We are taught that beneath the thin crust we walk on there is thousands of miles of crushing, boiling magma and a solid iron core at the very center. The idea that a pilot could fly his airplane into a hole at the South Pole, enter a lush, tropical green valley, and meet an advanced civilization living inside the planet sounds like pure, unadulterated fantasy. But to truly understand Admiral Byrd's secret diary, we have to take a step sideways. We need to look horizontally across human history and realize that the concept of a hollow Earth is not a modern internet conspiracy theory, and it was not invented by Hollywood science fiction writers. In fact, for centuries, the idea that our planet might be hollow was considered a perfectly legitimate, highly respected scientific theory, and it was championed by some of the most brilliant minds in recorded history. To make this incredibly simple, instead of picturing the Earth as a solid apple, imagine it as a hollow coconut. You have the thick, hard, outer shell where we live, the oceans, the mountains, and the dirt. But if you were to drill all the way through that shell, you would not hit a solid core. You would break through the ceiling of a massive, hollow interior space. The man who first brought this idea into the realm of serious mathematical science was not a crazy person. His name was Edmund Halley. If that name sounds familiar, it is because he is the exact same legendary English astronomer who discovered Halley's comet in the late 1600s. Halley was an absolute genius, a peer of Isaac Newton, and a man who mapped the stars and fundamentally changed our understanding of the universe. In the year 1692, Halley was trying to solve a massive problem for the British Navy. Sailors navigating the oceans relied entirely on magnetic compasses to find their way. But the compasses kept changing. The magnetic North Pole was not staying in one place. It was slowly wandering across the top of the globe. This wandering magnetic field caused ships to get lost and crash. Halley sat down with his advanced mathematics to figure out why the magnetic poles were moving. His conclusion was absolutely mind-bending. Halley proposed that the Earth was not one solid piece of rock. He suggested that the Earth was actually made up of multiple hollow shells, layered inside of each other exactly like a set of wooden Russian nesting dolls. He calculated that there was an outer crust where humanity lived and two inner concentric shells spinning independently inside. Because these inner shells were spinning at different speeds than the outer crust, they generated their own magnetic fields, which perfectly explained why the compasses on the surface were constantly shifting and acting erratically. Halley did not stop there. He was a man of bold ideas. He suggested that the spaces between these massive inner shells were filled with a glowing, luminous atmosphere. And most importantly, he theorized that these inner layers of the Earth were entirely capable of supporting life. He mathematically argued that there could be vast, hidden ecosystems, complete with plants, animals, and perhaps even advanced civilizations living right beneath our feet, illuminated by a glowing gas that acted like an artificial sun. When you remember what Admiral Byrd's diary stated, that his compasses began spinning wildly out of control just before he crossed into the glowing, artificially lit Green Valley, the connection to Edmund Halley's 300-year-old scientific theory becomes terrifyingly precise. Byrd experienced exactly the magnetic chaos that Halley mathematically predicted. Following Halley, other massive figures in the scientific community picked up the torch. In the 1700s, Leonhard Euler, one of the greatest mathematicians to ever live, simplified Halley's theory. Euler proposed that the Earth did not have multiple layers, but rather just one massive, hollow interior. At the very center of this hollow void, suspended by gravity, was a small, glowing internal sun that provided perfect, endless warmth and light to the inner world. But the man who truly brought the hollow Earth theory to the American public and directly paved the way for polar expeditions like Operation Highjump, was a former United States Army officer named John Cleves Sims, Jr. In the year 1818, Sims published a manifesto declaring to the entire world that the Earth was completely hollow. But Sims added a crucial mechanical detail. He asked a simple question: how do you get inside? Sims aggressively argued that the Earth was open at the extreme top and bottom. He believed there were massive, gaping holes thousands of miles wide at both the North Pole and the South Pole. He called them Sims holes. He spent the rest of his life relentlessly campaigning, giving lectures across the country, and literally begging the United States Congress to fund a massive military expedition to sail directly to the North Pole, find the massive opening, and sail straight down into the center of the Earth to trade with the people living inside. While Congress thought Sims was a bit too eccentric and denied his funding, his intense campaigning successfully ignited America's obsession with polar exploration. It is the direct historical reason why the United States Navy eventually began sending explorers like Richard E. Byrd into the extreme ice in the first place. They were, secretly or not, always looking for the openings that Sims promised were there. But if we look even further back, long before the scientists of the 1600s and 1800s were doing their mathematics, we find something even more incredible. The idea of an inhabited inner Earth is deeply woven into the oldest mythologies, religions, and folklore of almost every ancient culture on the planet. It is a universal human memory. In the secret diary of Admiral Byrd, the ancient man he met identified his realm as Agartha. This is not a random science fiction name that Byrd made up. Agartha is a very real, deeply entrenched concept in Eastern esoteric traditions. For thousands of years, ancient Tibetan and Hindu texts have spoken of Agartha, sometimes called Shambhala, as a legendary, perfect kingdom hidden deep within the earth. According to the ancient lore, Agartha is a sprawling subterranean network of magnificent cities connected by massive, perfectly smooth underground tunnels. It is said to be inhabited by the Ascended Masters, a race of spiritually and technologically supreme beings. The legends say that these beings originally lived on the surface of the earth thousands of years ago, perhaps during the time of Atlantis. But when massive global cataclysms, floods, and atomic wars threatened to destroy the surface, the brightest and most peaceful of humanity retreated underground. They used incredibly advanced technology to carve out their utopia, completely insulating themselves from the violence, disease, and harsh weather of the outer crust. They became the silent watchers of the world, occasionally sending messengers to the surface to guide human civilization when it was on the brink of total self-destruction. This perfectly mirrors the exact conversation Byrd claimed to have had with the Master. This concept is not limited to Asia. If you travel across the ocean to the indigenous tribes of North America, you will find the exact same story. The ancient Hopi tribe of the American Southwest has a deeply sacred creation myth. They believe that their ancestors did not evolve from monkeys on the surface, but rather they emerged from deep underground. The Hopi legend states that during a massive global cataclysm, their people were saved by the Ant people, a mysterious race of beings who lived in deep, subterranean cavern cities. The Ant people took the Hopi ancestors underground, fed them, and protected them until the surface of the earth was safe to inhabit again. The ancient Greeks fiercely believed in the Underworld, a vast physical cavern system ruled by Hades, filled with rivers and fortresses. The ancient Nordic cultures believed in Svartalfheim, a massive subterranean realm inhabited by brilliant beings who forged magical, technologically impossible weapons. Even the Celtic myths of Ireland speak of the Tuatha De Danann, a race of godlike beings who, after being defeated in a massive war, retreated into deep, hidden mounds and underground kingdoms, effectively becoming the people of the Hollow Hills. When you take a step back and look at all of this data laid out horizontally, a profoundly chilling picture begins to emerge. You have ancient tribes in America, mystics in Tibet, and philosophers in ancient Greece, cultures separated by massive oceans and thousands of years of history, all independently telling the exact same story about a highly advanced civilization living beneath the crust of the Earth. Then you have brilliant classical scientists like Edmund Halley and John Cleves Sims mathematically arguing that the Earth's structure perfectly supports massive hollow ecosystems with polar entrances. Finally, you have Admiral Richard E. Byrd, the most credible, mentally stable, and decorated explorer in American military history. He takes an airplane to the absolute most isolated, frozen wasteland on the planet. His magnetic compasses go completely insane. Exactly as Halley predicted, he flies into a massive opening that looks exactly like a Simmy's hole, and he lands in a glowing crystal city belonging to Agartha, exactly as the ancient Tibetan texts described. Byrd's diary ceases to look like the fictional ramblings of a hallucinating pilot. Instead, it looks incredibly like the ultimate physical proof of a 5,000-year-old human mystery. It suggests that the myths were never just fairy tales, and the early scientists were completely right. As Admiral Byrd prepared to leave the glowing utopian realm of the Master and return to his freezing airplane, he was carrying the greatest scientific and historical revelation in the history of mankind. But as he would soon discover, bringing the ultimate truth back to a world deeply entrenched in the paranoia of the Cold War was a mission far more dangerous than flying into the hollow Earth itself. The journey back to the freezing, violent reality of the surface world felt like waking up from a beautiful, impossibly perfect dream. As Admiral Richard E. Byrd walked away from the massive, glowing crystal cathedral and the ancient, profoundly wise man known as the Master, a heavy, cold knot of anxiety began to form in his stomach. He stepped back onto the smooth, silently hovering sled, escorted by the same two tall, perfectly calm, blonde-haired figures. They glided flawlessly back through the lush, tropical gardens of Agartha, finally arriving at the glowing marble landing platform where his twin-engine military transport plane sat waiting. His radio man was sitting near the aircraft, looking absolutely stunned, but perfectly safe. Byrd climbed back into the freezing, cramped metal cockpit of the airplane. He began zipping up his heavy, fur-lined polar survival suit, feeling the rough, heavy fabric restrict his movements. It was a stark, depressing physical reminder of the harsh, primitive world he belonged to. As they strapped themselves into their seats, the two gleaming, silver disc-shaped flying machines suddenly materialized out of the golden, artificial sky. They took up their precise flanking positions on the left and right wings of the airplane. Once again, the invisible, overwhelmingly powerful magnetic tractor beam gripped the heavy aircraft. Byrd did not have to touch the controls or start the engines. The airplane simply lifted vertically off the glowing platform in perfect, eerie silence. The silver discs guided the airplane smoothly upward, carrying it over the lush, green canopy of the prehistoric forest and up toward the massive, dark, snowless mountain range that shielded the hidden valley. As they crossed the invisible threshold over the mountain peaks, the environment outside the cockpit window violently snapped back to reality. The warm, golden light of the inner world instantly vanished, replaced by the harsh, blinding white glare of the Antarctic sun reflecting off thousands of miles of dead ice. The temperature gauge inside the cockpit plummeted drastically, dropping from a comfortable 74 degrees straight down to 50 degrees below zero in a matter of seconds. The freezing, howling polar winds slammed into the hull of the airplane, violently shaking the metal frame. Suddenly, the heavy, suffocating blanket of static in Byrd's radio headset broke with a sharp, ear-piercing crackle. The calm, melodic voice of his escorts came through one final time. "We are leaving you now, Admiral," the voice stated. "Your controls are free. Auf Wiedersehen." In the blink of an eye, the two silver discs accelerated straight up into the pale blue sky at a speed so staggering they simply disappeared, leaving absolutely no exhaust trail behind. Byrd immediately grabbed the yoke and furiously hit the ignition switches. The massive twin engines roared back to life, spitting black exhaust and vibrating violently. The radio channel was suddenly flooded with the frantic, panicked voices of the American radio operators back at the McMurdo base camp. They had been tracking the aircraft's disappearance for hours and assumed Byrd had crashed into the ice. Byrd keyed his microphone and responded, his voice shaking slightly. He gave them his coordinates and told them he was returning to base. But as he flew back over the endless, freezing wasteland, his mind was racing 1,000,000 miles an hour. He had just been handed the most profound, terrifying, and important message in the history of human civilization. He had to tell the President of the United States that they needed to immediately dismantle their nuclear weapons. But how do you explain that to a world that is completely consumed by paranoia? When Admiral Byrd finally landed back at the frozen runway of the American base camp, he did not run out of the airplane shouting about crystal cities and woolly mammoths. He was a highly disciplined, deeply experienced military officer. He knew that if he spoke too loudly or to the wrong people, he would be immediately declared insane, thrown into a straitjacket, and locked in a psychiatric hospital. The message from the master was far too important to risk being dismissed as a hallucination, so Byrd remained completely silent on the ice. He filed a highly classified, heavily guarded preliminary report directly to the highest levels of the Pentagon, requesting an immediate, top-secret debriefing in Washington, D.C. Within days, Byrd was pulled off the ice, placed on a fast transport plane, and flown directly back to the United States. When he arrived in Washington, D.C. in March of 1956, there were no cheering crowds. There was no ticker-tape parade like he had received in his youth. Instead, he was immediately escorted by heavily armed military police into the deep, windowless, heavily guarded subterranean levels of the Pentagon. To understand the sheer intensity of the interrogation Byrd was about to face, you have to understand the terrifying political climate of the United States in the mid-1950s. This was the absolute peak of the Cold War. The entire country was suffocating under the Red Scare. The government was terrified of Soviet spies infiltrating the country. American children were being taught to hide under their wooden school desks to survive a nuclear bomb. The military-industrial complex was spending billions of dollars racing to build the hydrogen bomb, a weapon thousands of times more destructive than the ones dropped on Japan. The men running the Pentagon were completely obsessed with total global control, absolute secrecy, and overwhelming military dominance. Byrd was seated at a table across from the highest-ranking generals of the armed forces, top-level advisors to President Dwight D. Eisenhower, and directors from the newly formed Central Intelligence Agency. For hours, they relentlessly grilled him. Byrd laid out everything. He described the magnetic anomalies that completely disabled his instruments. He described the Green Valley, the impossible warm climate, and the advanced silver flying discs that effortlessly hijacked his airplane. And finally, he delivered the grave, terrifying warning from the master of Agartha. Humanity's use of atomic weapons was pulling the entire planet toward a dark age of total destruction, and the advanced beings of the inner Earth would not allow humanity to destroy the globe. The reaction from the men in the grey suits was not one of wonder or spiritual awakening. It was pure, unadulterated terror and immediate defensive aggression. Put yourself in the shoes of a five-star American general in 1956. Your entire job is to project ultimate power and protect the country from the Soviets. Suddenly, your most trusted, famous explorer tells you that the greatest threat to America is not Russia, but a technologically supreme, godlike civilization living right under your feet. A civilization that can disable your aircraft with invisible magnets and considers your most advanced nuclear weapons to be the dangerous toys of angry children. Furthermore, the message from Agartha demanded complete nuclear disarmament and world peace. To the paranoid, heavily armed men of the Pentagon, this sounded like absolute madness. Disarming their nuclear weapons meant giving the Soviet Union a free pass to conquer the globe. The government realized they were facing an impossible situation. If they went public with Admiral Byrd's story, it would cause absolute, immediate global panic. The stock markets would collapse, organized religion would be thrown into chaos, and most importantly, the citizens of the United States would realize that their massive, expensive military was completely powerless to protect them from the flying discs of the inner Earth. National security is essentially a heavy, dark blanket that the government throws over anything that terrifies them or threatens their control. And they immediately threw the heaviest blanket they had directly over Admiral Richard E. Byrd. The interrogation ended not with medals, but with strict, terrifying orders. Byrd was explicitly reminded of his military oath, an oath he had sworn to uphold with his life. He was ordered to remain completely, totally, and absolutely silent regarding everything he had seen, heard, and experienced during that flight. He was legally forbidden from speaking to the press, he was forbidden from writing about it in public books, and he was forbidden from even discussing it with his own family. For a man whose entire life had been defined by seeking the truth, exploring the unknown, and bringing the wonders of the world back to the public, this gag order was a devastating, crushing psychological blow. He was not a spy, he was a scientist and an explorer, yet he was now being forced to live the rest of his life as a prisoner of his own government's fear. The final year of Admiral Byrd's life was defined by a profound, agonizing internal torment. He was physically deteriorating, his heart growing weak from decades of pushing his body to the absolute limits in the freezing cold. But the true heavy burden was the secret. He walked around knowing that he held the key to humanity's salvation or its ultimate destruction, but his mouth was permanently stitched shut by the threat of treason. He watched the news as the United States and the Soviet Union continued to fiercely test massive nuclear weapons, ignoring the very warning that he had risked his life to bring back. He watched the world speed blindly toward the exact dark age that the master had prophesied. Unable to speak the truth aloud, Byrd turned to the only place where he was still truly free, his private, locked diary. In the quiet, lonely moments of his final days, he meticulously wrote down every single detail of the Green Valley, the flying discs, and the Crystal City. He documented his interrogation at the Pentagon and the harsh censorship that followed. In December of 1956, just months before his death, Admiral Byrd allegedly wrote the final, haunting entry in his secret diary. It is a quote that perfectly captures the tragedy of a great man forced into silence. He wrote, "These last few years elapsed since 1947 have not been kind. I now make my final entry in this singular diary. In closing, I must state that I have faithfully kept this matter secret as directed all these years. It has been completely against my values of moral right. Now I seem to sense the long night coming on, and this secret will not die with me, but as all truth shall, it will triumph, and so it shall." He concluded the entry with a beautiful, defiant sentence. "Just as the long night of the Arctic ends, the brilliant sunshine of truth shall come again, and those who are of darkness shall fall in its light. For I have seen that land beyond the pole, that center of the great unknown." On March 11, 1957, Admiral Richard E. Byrd passed away quietly in his sleep at his home in Boston. He was buried with full military honors in Arlington National Cemetery. The government praised him as a hero of the ice, carefully celebrating his public achievements while keeping the true, monumental climax of his life buried under mountains of classified documents. But as Byrd predicted, the truth is like water. It always finds a crack to leak through. Years after his death, the contents of his secret diary mysteriously surfaced. Whether it was leaked by a sympathetic family member or smuggled out by an intelligence officer with a guilty conscience, the diary entered the public domain, igniting a firestorm of debate, conspiracy, and awe that continues to burn brightly to this very day. Decades have passed since Admiral Richard E. Byrd took his final breath, carrying the heavy, agonizing weight of his secret diary to the grave. We are no longer living in the 1950s. We do not have to rely on brave men flying fragile, propeller-driven airplanes blindly into raging blizzards to tell us what is hiding at the bottom of the earth. Today, humanity possesses a dazzling array of modern technology. We have satellites orbiting the globe, constantly taking high-definition photographs. We have laser altimeters and highly advanced scientific instruments that can practically see through solid objects. So, the most obvious, glaring question is this. If Admiral Byrd actually flew into a lush green valley, and if there really is a massive, highly advanced subterranean civilization hiding under the ice, why hasn't modern science definitively proven it? To answer that, we have to look closely at how modern science actually studies Antarctica, and more importantly, who controls that science. The primary tool that modern glaciologists and military researchers use to look beneath the ice today is called ground-penetrating radar, or GPR. To understand how this works without needing a degree in physics, Imagine an incredibly powerful radio transmitter strapped to the bottom of a specialized airplane. As the plane flies over the frozen wasteland, it violently shoots invisible pulses of radio energy straight down into the ground. These radio waves slice completely through the miles of solid ice until they hit something hard, like bedrock, liquid water, or perhaps a massive metallic structure. When the waves hit that hard surface, they bounce back up to the airplane, where a computer catches them and draws a map. It is essentially exactly like taking a massive planetary X-ray. Officially, the scientists analyzing these radar maps will tell you that they have successfully mapped the entire bedrock of the Antarctic continent. They will tell you that there are no massive, hollow openings at the poles and no glowing crystal cities. They did, however, find something that partially validates the geographic descriptions in Admiral Byrd's diary. Deep beneath the ice, completely buried and hidden from human eyes, radar revealed a massive, sprawling mountain range called the Gamburtsev subglacial mountains. These peaks are exactly as high as the European Alps. So, Byrd's claim of seeing massive, jagged mountains where there should have only been flat ice was absolutely correct. Modern science just claims those mountains are currently completely covered by thousands of feet of frozen water, not exposed to a warm, artificial sky. But if you are a skeptic of the official government narrative, you have to ask a crucial question. Who exactly is running these radar sweeps, and who gets to filter the data before the public sees it? This brings us to one of the most bizarre and fascinating geopolitical anomalies in modern history, the Antarctic Treaty. Remember the terrifying political climate of the 1950s? The United States and the Soviet Union were locked in a desperate, paranoid Cold War. They were fiercely competing for global domination, fighting proxy wars, racing to build enough nuclear weapons to vaporize the globe, and scrambling to claim every single strategic piece of land on the planet. Yet, in 1959, just 2 years after Admiral Byrd died, and barely a decade after the panicked, heavily armed retreat of Operation Highjump, something completely inexplicable happened. The United States, the Soviet Union, and 10 other major global nations sat down at a table and signed the Antarctic Treaty. Suddenly, in the middle of the most hostile geopolitical standoff in human history, the most powerful nations on Earth completely agreed to share a continent larger than the United States and Europe combined. The treaty explicitly banned any and all military activity, nuclear testing, and weapons deployments in Antarctica. If you view this through the lens of traditional history, it is hailed as a beautiful, unparalleled triumph of global peace and scientific cooperation. But if you view it through the lens of Admiral Byrd's secret diary and the warnings of the Master of Agartha, the Antarctic Treaty looks completely different. It does not look like a peace treaty. It looks exactly like a global quarantine zone. Did the world's governments secretly realize that they had kicked a hornet's nest during Operation Highjump? Did they realize that the continent was occupied by a technologically supreme force that they could not possibly defeat? If the Master truly ordered humanity to stop their atomic madness and stay away, the Antarctic Treaty is the exact legal document you would draft to ensure that no rogue military commander ever accidentally started an apocalyptic war with the inner Earth. Even today, Antarctica remains the most heavily restricted, tightly controlled landmass on the planet. You cannot simply buy a boat, sail down to the South Pole, and start exploring wherever you want. Independent, unguided exploration is strictly prohibited. You have to jump through massive bureaucratic hoops, obtain intense government permits, and agree to strictly follow predetermined, heavily monitored routes. To conspiracy theorists, this intense level of security is not about protecting the fragile local penguin populations. It is about keeping independent researchers from accidentally stumbling onto the massive hidden entrances to the subterranean world. Furthermore, even within the strict confines of official government-sanctioned science, researchers have recently discovered things beneath the ice that are profoundly mysterious and completely validate the fundamental mechanics of Byrd's story. The greatest example of this is Lake Vostok. In the 1990s, utilizing that powerful ground-penetrating radar, Russian and British scientists discovered something completely impossible, hiding directly beneath one of the coldest spots on Earth. Buried under more than 2 miles of solid, crushing ice is a massive, completely liquid lake. Lake Vostok is absolutely enormous. It is roughly the same size as Lake Ontario in North America. How does a massive body of water remain completely liquid under 2 miles of freezing ice? The answer is extreme geothermal heat radiating from deep within the Earth's core. The heat pushes up from below, melting the bottom of the glacier, creating a massive, perfectly sealed liquid pocket that has been isolated from the rest of the world for roughly 15 million years. Lake Vostok is incredibly important to the Admiral Byrd mystery because it proves beyond any shadow of a scientific doubt that extreme geothermal heating can create massive, warm, life-sustaining environments completely hidden beneath the ice. If a lake the size of Lake Ontario can exist down there, completely invisible from the surface, then the idea of a massive, warm, geothermally heated cavern system supporting a lush green valley, exactly like the Schirmacher oasis the Germans found, or the Agarthan entrance Byrd described, is no longer a crazy science fiction fantasy. It is a proven geological possibility. Adding to the mystery, scientists have measured a massive, completely unexplained magnetic anomaly at the eastern edge of Lake Vostok. The magnetic field in that specific area is violently distorted, exactly like the localized magnetic chaos that completely disabled the compasses on Admiral Byrd's transport plane. Official scientists suggest the anomaly is caused by a massive thinning of the Earth's crust in that area, but to those who believe Byrd's diary, that magnetic distortion is the exact signature of a massive, heavily shielded subterranean city or an active Agarthan gateway. Because official scientific expeditions are so tightly controlled, the modern hunt for the truth has largely been taken over by thousands of civilian sleuths sitting at their computer desks, utilizing tools like Google Earth to meticulously scan the high-definition satellite imagery of the frozen continent. And what these internet explorers are finding is incredibly difficult to explain away. 2. One of the most famous modern anomalies is the so-called Antarctic pyramids. Deep within the Ellsworth mountain range, satellite cameras have captured clear images of massive, towering peaks poking through the snow. But these are not normal, jagged mountains. They are completely symmetrical, featuring 4 perfectly flat, geometrically precise sides that rise to a sharp point. They look exactly like the Great Pyramid of Giza in Egypt, only they are massively larger and completely encased in ice. Mainstream geologists are quick to dismiss these structures as nunataks, a natural geological phenomenon where harsh, freezing winds erode a mountain peak into a sharp, angular shape over millions of years. But to an open-minded observer, the sheer geometric perfection of these massive structures looks incredibly artificial. They look like the ancient, frozen remnants of a lost civilization that inhabited the continent millions of years ago, long before it was entirely covered in ice, tying perfectly into the ancient legends of highly advanced beings retreating underground when the surface climate shifted. Even more alarming are the massive, perfectly circular black holes that civilian researchers constantly find on satellite maps. These are not small crevasses or natural ice caves. We are talking about massive, gaping voids in the sides of sheer ice cliffs, some measuring hundreds of feet across. They look exactly like massive, artificial tunnel entrances. What is most suspicious about these massive holes is that shortly after civilian researchers post the coordinates online, the satellite imagery on Google Earth in that specific location is frequently blurred out, censored, or covered by a blatant digital patch, further fueling the intense suspicion that the military is actively hiding the entrances to Simmers' holes. Finally, there is the Wilkes land gravity anomaly. Satellites measuring the gravitational pull of the Earth discovered a massive, dense object buried more than 300 miles wide, deep beneath the ice of the Wilkes Land region in Antarctica. The official scientific explanation is that it is the crater of a massive asteroid that hit the Earth millions of years ago, an impact so violent it may have caused the greatest mass extinction in the planet's history. But alternative researchers look at that massive, hyperdense anomaly and see something else entirely. They see the exact radar signature of a colossal metallic structure. They see a crashed mothership, or perhaps the sprawling, heavily armored roof of Base 211, the rumored subterranean fortress built by fleeing German scientists. Today, Antarctica remains a massive, frozen paradox. On one hand, it is a heavily monitored, sterile environment where traditional scientists diligently drill ice cores to study ancient weather patterns. On the other hand, it is the center of the greatest enduring mystery of the modern age. The ice is slowly, inevitably melting, and as the white curtain pulls back, the bizarre anomalies captured by our satellites are only growing in number. We are left standing exactly where Admiral Richard E. Byrd stood when he was locked in that Pentagon briefing room. We are caught between the sterile, comfortable explanations offered by government authorities and the terrifying, mind-bending possibility that the reality of our planet is completely different from what we have been taught. The modern discoveries of subglacial lakes, magnetic distortions, and impossible geometry captured by satellites do not explicitly prove that Byrd met an ancient master in a crystal city, but they absolutely prove that the continent of Antarctica is hiding massive, world-altering secrets just beneath the surface. The story of Operation Highjump and Admiral Richard E. Byrd's secret diary sits exactly on the razor-thin edge between documented military history and the ultimate science fiction fantasy. We know for an absolute fact that a massive, heavily armed American naval fleet rushed to the frozen continent of Antarctica in 1946. We know they suffered tragic casualties, encountered bizarre, hostile conditions, and retreated months ahead of schedule in a state of complete panic. We also know, without a doubt, that Byrd gave a terrifying public warning to the press about transpolar flying objects before his own government forced him into a lifetime of absolute silence. Whether you believe that Byrd physically flew his airplane into a lush, geothermally heated green valley to meet the ancient master of Agartha, or you believe the diary was a desperate, metaphorical warning written by a brilliant man terrified of the Cold War, the core message remains profoundly important. The secret journal is a haunting mirror held up to human civilization. It reminds us that our rapid technological advancement, specifically our ability to create world-ending atomic weapons, has vastly outpaced our spiritual and emotional maturity. The diary pleads with humanity to stop dividing ourselves, to dismantle our weapons of mass destruction, and to recognize that if we do not learn to live in peace, we will inevitably engineer our own dark age. The ice of Antarctica is melting, and perhaps soon the center of the great unknown will finally reveal its ultimate truth to the surface world. Do you think Admiral Byrd's diary is a suppressed historical reality, or was it simply the freezing hallucination of a desperate explorer lost in the Antarctic blizzard? Let me know down in the comments below.